In the year 435 AD, the most powerful diplomats of the Eastern Roman Empire were forced to negotiate a peace treaty. And, well, they were forced into conditions designed specifically to humiliate them.
Right, completely humiliating.
Yeah, they stood ankle-deep in the mud on the banks of the river Morava. And towering above them, refusing to even dismount from their war horses, sat two young kings.
Just looking down on them.
Literally looking down on the representatives of the most advanced civilization on Earth. And they calmly dictated terms that would, basically begin to bankrupt the ancient world.
It's a masterclass in psychological dominance. You have these Roman envoys draped in the silk and all the prestige of Constantinople, right? And they are physically positioned as inferiors to these heavily armed men that their own Roman propaganda had always dismissed as mere savages.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are speaking directly to you, the listener, regarding this massive curation project you're currently working on. You've tasked us with exploring a candidate for a fictional hall of ruthless rulers, which is a concept being developed by the character Young Xingli and the AI Ray.
It's a fascinating project.
It really is.
Yep.
And to construct this analysis, you've provided a really rich stack of sources. We've got encyclopedic entries, historical biographies, and some deep academic research, all focusing on the ultimate candidate for this hall, Attila the Hun.
And, the overarching challenge presented by these sources is that the historical record of this man was written entirely by his victims.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We are essentially forced to read between the lines of these traumatized chroniclers just to piece together the actual mechanics of his power.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the primary mission you've given us today, listener, is to dismantle that cartoonish barbarian stereotype.
Right, the guy in the animal skins.
Exactly. When pop culture conjures Attila the Hun, the image is usually a chaotic warlord swinging a sword, burning cities, simply because he, enjoys the flames.
Yeah.
But reading through the economic and diplomatic records you provided, a completely different modern analogy emerges.
Yeah, it really does.
We aren't looking at a chaotic marauder. We are looking at a highly sophisticated geopolitical mafia boss who is running an international protection racket. Do you think that's a fair analogy?
I do. What's fascinating here is that the structural mechanisms of his reign align perfectly with organized crime, just on a continental scale.
Wow.
He weaponized the threat of violence just as effectively as the violence itself. He was highly educated, chillingly calculating, and he constructed this extortion apparatus that systematically bled both halves of the Roman Empire dry.
That's wild to think about.
It is. However, to understand the architecture of Attila's empire, we have to rewind the clock a bit. We have to examine the catastrophic continental upheaval his people triggered before he was even born, literally just by showing up on the map of Europe.
Right, because the sources map this out brilliantly. The Huns didn't just casually cross a border, they triggered a tectonic shift.
Absolutely.
We are dealing with a confederation of Eurasian nomads, and the historical consensus places their origins somewhere in Central Asia. Around 370 AD, they began this massive westward migration, crossing the Volga River. And their arrival on the eastern fringes of Europe created a terrifying, cascading domino effect.
Yeah, and to grasp the scale of this, you really have to look at the geopolitical equilibrium of Europe in the late 4th century.
Setting the stage.
Exactly. So the Roman Empire is divided into East and West, and is managing its vast borders through this complex system of treaties and buffer states.
Right.
Just beyond the Roman frontier, stretching across modern-day Eastern Europe and Germany, you have various established agrarian and semi-nomadic Germanic tribes. The Goths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Alans.
And then the Huns show up.
Right. When the Hunnic cavalry crosses the Volga in the 370s, they don't engage the Roman legions. They hit those buffer states. They overrun the territory of the Alans, absorbing a lot of them, and then they completely shatter the Gothic kingdom that was situated between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River.
So it's less like an invading army and more like a bowling ball hitting the pins of Europe.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
The Roman Empire wasn't fighting the bowling ball at first. They were being crushed by the sheer weight of the scattering pins. Suddenly, you have hundreds of thousands of displaced, terrified Germanic peoples fleeing westward and southward. And they are violently forcing their way across Roman borders because they believe whatever the Romans will do to them is vastly preferable to facing the Huns.
Yeah, they're absolutely terrified. And the demographic and economic strain this placed on the Roman system was catastrophic.
I can imagine.
Just to give you an example, in 376 AD, a massive confederation of Goths begs for asylum across the Danube. The Roman logistical apparatus completely fails to feed them. This leads to mass starvation, exploitation by corrupt Roman governors.
Which never helps.
Never. And ultimately, it sparks an apocalyptic rebellion. This culminates in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople, where these desperate Goths annihilate a Roman army and kill the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens.
Wow, just the ripple effect is insane.
It really is. And fast forward to December 31st, 406 AD. A massive coalition of Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and Burgundians crosses the frozen Rhine River right into Roman Gaul.
Which fundamentally destabilized the Western Empire's economy and military infrastructure.
Exactly. And the Huns achieved all of this geopolitical restructuring without engaging in sustained direct warfare with Rome. They operated as a purely pastoral, nomadic warrior society.
Right.
Their logistics relied on massive herds of horses and sheep. Their diet was heavily dependent on meat and milk, and their composite bow-wielding cavalry possessed this aura of total tactical invincibility.
And right in the epicenter of this chaotic, rapid expansion, roughly around the year 406 AD, Attila is born.
Right.
But the sources make a crucial distinction here for you to note, listener. He is not born in an isolated tent on the fringes of the steppes. He is born into the absolute highest echelons of a newly wealthy, rapidly centralizing Hunnic aristocracy.
Yes, his father was a man named Munzuk, who was the brother to the joint Hunnic kings Octor and Ruga.
So royalty, basically.
Essentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
This places Attila firmly within the royal lineage that is actively consolidating power over this vast, multi-ethnic confederacy.
Which introduces a detail from the research that totally shatters the Roman propaganda.
Oh, absolutely.
The Romans needed their citizens to view the Huns as unlettered, mindless savages to justify their defeats. Right.
They did.
But the sources reveal that Attila, alongside his older brother Bleda, received an incredibly rigorous elite upbringing. They were essentially Renaissance barbarians.
I love that phrase. And it's true. Their curriculum was designed to produce absolute rulers. The primary accounts confirm they were extensively schooled in the physical requirements of Hunnic leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Horsemanship, mounted archery, close quarters sword fighting, and the use of the lasso in combat.
The lasso? That's intense.
It was highly effective. But the intellectual training is what really separates them from mere warlords. They were educated in grand military strategy, international diplomacy, and, crucial to their later success, they were multilingual.
Yeah, that blew my mind. They weren't just relying on translators. They spoke their native Hunnic tongue, but the evidence strongly suggests they spoke, and possibly even read, Gothic and Latin.
Right.
They were being explicitly groomed to rule a sprawling, diverse empire and to negotiate directly with the greatest superpower on Earth. They learned the language of their enemies to understand the Roman legal and bureaucratic systems they intended to exploit.
And we also have to consider the physical presence of the man, because projecting power was a core component of his statecraft.
Right, image is everything.
Exactly. Now, we don't possess a completely intact first-hand account of his appearance, but we do have a highly detailed second-hand description preserved by the Gothic historian Jordanes.
Okay.
And Jordanes is directly citing a lost work by the Byzantine diplomat Priscus, who personally traveled to Attila's court and stood in his presence.
And the physical description Priscus provides is strikingly vivid, right? It avoids the usual monstrous caricatures we expect.
It does.
He describes a man short in stature, with a broad chest, a large head, small, deep-set eyes, a thin beard sprinkled with gray, a flat nose, and swarthy skin. But it's a kinetic energy the way Attila moved that clearly left a mark on the diplomat.
Yeah, Priscus wrote that he had a haughty walk, rolling his eyes hither and thither, so that the power of his proud spirit appeared in the movement of his body.
I mean, that is the description of a sovereign who acutely understands the theatricality of terror.
Oh, without a doubt.
He didn't just hold power, he physically manifested it to unnerve those around him. Yet Jordanes, pulling from these contemporary accounts, notes a fascinating paradox.
What's that?
He writes that Attila was a lover of war, yet restrained in action. Mighty in counsel, gracious to suppliants, and lenient to those received into his protection.
Which is so telling.
Right. The portrait is not of a berserker who loses control in a blood frenzy. It is the portrait of a cold, calculated statesman who utilized fear as a precision instrument.
And that elite diplomatic training and overwhelming force of personality were suddenly called into action in 434 AD.
Ah, right, the family business.
Yeah, the Hunnic family business experienced a very violent shift in management. Attila's uncles, the joint kings Octor and Ruga, Both died under remarkably sudden circumstances.
Okay, the historical records regarding their deaths really highlight the physical toll of this lifestyle. Let's talk about Octor first.
Okay.
He commanded the Western Front against the Germanic tribes along the Rhine, and he reportedly died from complications related to severe overeating at a banquet.
Yeah, that is what the sources claim.
I mean, a rather unglamorous end for a warlord commanding the Western frontier.
Right, you picture this grizzled veteran, and he essentially just eats himself to death. And then Ruga, who commanded the Eastern Wing and had been actively menacing the borders of Constantinople, well, he was allegedly struck by lightning during a campaign.
Struck by lightning? You really can't write this stuff.
You really can't. So with the previous generation wiped out almost simultaneously, the entire mechanism of the Hunnic Empire falls to Attila and his older brother Bleda.
Which introduces a recurring structural element of Hunnic political culture, the diarchy or joint rule.
Exactly. Just as Octor and Ruga shared dominion, Attila and Bleda assumed joint leadership of the empire in 434 AD.
And they waste absolutely no time asserting their dominance. The very first geopolitical maneuver they execute is summoning the envoys of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II to that muddy riverbank we discussed at the start of the deep dive.
The famous riverbank meeting.
Right. The resulting Treaty of Margus in 435 AD is where we see the extortion racket fully formalized.
The demands they force upon the Romans were economically staggering. You have to remember the Eastern Empire was already paying the Huns a substantial annual tribute simply to maintain a fragile peace along the Danube frontier.
But the brothers look at that tribute and basically decide to squeeze the Roman economy until it breaks.
Yeah, they do.
They force Theodosius II to double the annual payment from 350 pounds of solid gold to 700 pounds of gold every single year.
And they don't stop at raw capital. They demand open border markets with guaranteed safe conduct for Hunnish traders. This ensures a continuous flow of Roman goods right into their territory. Plus, they impose a fixed ransom of 8 solidia for every Roman prisoner currently held by the Huns.
Let's break down the economic weight of that ransom for the listener, because it's huge. A solidus was a pure gold Roman coin, right?
Correct.
8 solidi was roughly equivalent to a Roman infantryman's total wages for an entire year.
It's an astronomical sum per person.
By demanding this fixed price per captive, they were simultaneously bankrupting the Roman provincial economies and extracting a massive transfer of wealth that entirely bypassed traditional Roman taxation.
It was brilliant, frankly.
Yeah.
But the final term of the treaty was perhaps the most vital for their internal security.
Oh, the fugitives.
Yes. They demanded the immediate extradition of any Hunnic fugitives who had sought political asylum within the Roman Empire.
Wait, if they are so powerful, why are they so concerned about a few refugees hiding in Roman territory? What threat do a handful of fugitives pose to an army of tens of thousands?
Well, these weren't impoverished farmers seeking a better life, you know. These fugitives were rival Hunnic aristocrats. They were likely princes and warlords who possessed legitimate blood claims to the throne and had opposed Attila and Bleda's ascension. Allowing them to survive in Roman exile meant allowing a government in waiting to exist.
Fully funded and supported by Roman intelligence, ready to launch a coup the moment the brothers showed weakness.
Exactly. Extraditing them was purely about eliminating internal political rivals.
And they enforced that elimination with brutal public spectacle. The Romans handed over 2 specific royal fugitives, boys named Mama and Atticam.
Right.
Attila and Bleda didn't quietly imprison them or integrate them back into the court. They dragged them to the fortress of Carsium and had them publicly crucified.
Horrific.
The message to their own people was undeniable. The Roman Empire cannot protect you. There is nowhere on earth you can hide. And defying our authority results in agonizing public execution.
And that ruthlessness worked. The Treaty of Margus temporarily stabilized the frontier. It bought Emperor Theodosius II a window of time, which he desperately used to reinforce the massive land walls of Constantinople.
Probably a smart move on his part.
Definitely. Meanwhile, the Huns, who were content with their new revenue stream, pivoted east to test the defenses of the Sassanid Empire in Persia. Though, I should note, Hunnic cavalry tactics proved less effective against the fortified Persian lines. But the peace with Rome was inherently fragile. It was tied entirely to the punctual delivery of gold. And by 440 AD, the Huns had returned to the Roman borders.
Because the bureaucracy in Constantinople delayed the tribute shipments. The mafia bosses didn't receive their tribute on time, so they decided to re-educate the Romans on the cost of doing business.
And the timing of their return was impeccably calculated. The Romans were facing a two-front geopolitical crisis. The Vandals, having crossed the Mediterranean, had just conquered Carthage in North Africa.
Which was huge, right?
Massive. Carthage served as the primary grain basket for the Western Roman Empire. And simultaneously, the Sassanid Shah initiated hostilities in Armenia. The Roman high command panicked and stripped their Balkan defenses, moving entire legions away to address these seemingly more pressing threats.
So Attila and Bleda saw the entire Balkan frontier left virtually undefended. And they launched a devastating invasion in 441, following up with a deeper thrust in 443 AD. And this is where the sources highlight a massive evolution in Hunnic warfare.
This is a critical point.
They aren't just a light cavalry force launching hit-and-run raids on undefended villages anymore, are they?
No, not at all. The Romans were horrified to discover that the Huns had acquired and mastered advanced siege engineering.
Which is wild.
Right. Nomadic pastoralists do not inherently know how to build torsion catapults or rolling siege towers.
So how did they do it?
The historical consensus is that the Huns actively captured Roman military engineers, offered them elevated status or wealth, and utilized their expertise to construct sophisticated siege trains.
They systematically reduced major fortified Roman cities to rubble. Viminatium fell. Singidunum, which is modern Belgrade, was destroyed. And then they laid siege to Nisus, modern-day Nisha in Serbia, and the destruction of Nisus is recorded as an event of almost apocalyptic violence.
The aftermath of that siege provides one of the most chilling primary source accounts of the entire era.
Yeah, when Priscus, the diplomat we mentioned earlier, traveled through the ruins of Nisus years after the attack on his way to Attila's court, he described a landscape that had been fundamentally erased.
Erased is the right word.
The city was a sprawling ghost town, inhabited only by a few diseased survivors scavenging among the ruined foundations of the churches. He wrote that they couldn't even make camp near the river, because the riverbanks were entirely choked with the skeletal remains of the slaughtered population.
It's a haunting image. And this was the application of maximum terror for maximum economic yield. They were demonstrating that Roman walls could no longer protect Roman citizens.
Right.
And the psychological impact broke the political will of Constantinople. Theodosius II capitulated completely, suing for peace under terms that were designed to bleed the empire dry.
How bad were the terms this time?
The brothers demanded an astronomical sum of 6,000 pounds of gold as immediate back pay for the delayed tribute, and they tripled the annual extortion rate to 2,100 pounds of gold per year.
The sheer logistics of moving and securing 2,100 pounds of gold annually in a non-banking society is mind-boggling. They are literally draining the lifeblood of the Eastern Empire's economy.
Absolutely draining it.
But despite running the most lucrative protection racket in human history, the diarchy structure possesses a fatal internal flaw. Extortion economies run on fear and absolute authority, and dividing that authority naturally breeds paranoia.
It does. In a system built entirely on the projection of strength, a co-ruler is simply a rival who sleeps in the same camp. So in 445 AD, after 11 years of amassing unprecedented wealth and power together, Bleda dies abruptly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When an all-powerful co-ruler dies suddenly in ancient history, the first thing we look for is the knife in his back.
Naturally. And the historiography leans heavily toward assassination here. Jordanes, pulling directly from Priscus's contemporary accounts, explicitly states that Bleda was killed through the treachery of his brother. The exact mechanics of the death, though, remain a subject of historical debate.
The most prevalent narrative suggests Attila engineered the assassination during a royal hunting trip, right? Framing the death as a tragic accident involving a wild boar.
That's the popular story, yes.
However, the sources also offer a compelling counter-narrative. That Bleda, recognizing the growing imbalance of power and Attila's expanding influence over the military chieftains, attempted a preemptive strike. But he was simply physically outmatched and killed by Attila in a direct confrontation.
Right. And while the forensic truth is lost to time, the political outcome was immediate and absolute.
Before we analyze how Attila reorganizes this empire as sole dictator, we have to look at a highly specific, bizarre detail the sources provide about Bleda's court, because it completely recontextualizes how we view these Hunnic kings.
Oh, the dwarf.
Yes. They weren't just hoarding gold in tents. Bleda had acquired, through his vast wealth, a Moorish dwarf named Zerko, and Bleda was absolutely obsessed with this man.
He adored him.
He found him endlessly entertaining, to the point where he commissioned a bespoke, scaled-down suit of elite armor specifically for Zerko, demanding that the dwarf ride alongside him into combat on military campaigns.
It's such a surreal image. But this detail from Priscus is invaluable. because it strips away that mindless savage trope and reveals the psychology of the newly wealthy Hunnic aristocracy.
Oh, so?
Well, they were engaging in the exact same conspicuous consumption and theatrical hoarding of anomalies that characterized the courts of Roman emperors or later Renaissance princes. They used their immense wealth to acquire human curiosities from the furthest corners of the known world just to display their global reach.
That makes total sense.
Interestingly, Bleda's presence left a permanent mark on European geography. The Hungarian city of Buda, the western half of modern Budapest, actually originates from the medieval Hungarian iteration of Bleda's name.
That is fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's a great piece of trivia.
But with Bleda eliminated, the diarchy is dead. If we connect this to the bigger picture, how does the internal structure of the empire shift now that Attila is the sole survivor?
It transitions from a shared enterprise into an absolute autocracy. Attila no longer has to consult a peer. He doesn't have to compromise on military targets or divide the spoils of extortion. He embarks on a rapid campaign of centralization, violently subduing any dissenting factions.
So he just crushes anyone who pushes back.
Exactly. And he unites all the disparate tribes, the native Huns, the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Alans, the Rugians, under one singular, terrifying chain of command. He is the sole CEO of the enterprise.
So he has absolute internal control, and he has mathematically proven that the Eastern Roman Empire is too terrified to fight him, content to simply drain their treasuries to keep him away. He needs a new target to keep his massive coalition of vassal tribes enriched and occupied.
He does.
And the historical record shows that the Western Roman Empire handed him the perfect legal pretext to invade, wrapped in one of the most absurd political scandals of late antiquity.
Yes, the Honoria affair. It is a prime example of how dynastic fragility in Rome collided directly with Attila's strategic genius.
Let's introduce Justa Grata Honoria to the listener. She is a royal princess, the older sister of the reigning Western Roman Emperor, Valentinian III. The year is 450 AD. The sources describe Honoria as deeply ambitious, highly educated, and frankly suffocating under the restrictive control of her younger brother.
And you have to understand the dynastic paranoia of the Theodosian house here. Valentinian III was a famously weak and insecure emperor.
Right.
If his sister, who carried the royal bloodline, married a powerful Roman general or charismatic senator, any son she produced would immediately possess a stronger, more legitimate claim to the throne than Valentinian himself.
A huge threat.
Massive. Therefore, her brother's primary political objective was to ensure she remained unmarried, or at least married to someone utterly politically impotent.
But Honoria's side, she isn't going to quietly fade into obscurity. She engages in a highly dangerous clandestine affair with her own estate manager, a man named Eugenius.
Which was a fatal mistake.
Yeah, when the affair is discovered, the political blowback is severe. Eugenius is immediately executed for treason. Valentinian realizes he needs to permanently neutralize his sister as a threat. He strips her of her independence, places her under tight house arrest, and arranges a forced marriage to a senator named Herculanus Bassus.
And Bassus is chosen specifically for his lack of ambition. The historical texts characterize him as a safe, unpretentious, remarkably boring man who posed zero threat to the emperor.
Faced with a lifetime locked in a gilded cage with a man she despises, Honoria makes a staggeringly reckless political gamble. She smuggles a loyal eunuch out of her estate, carrying a letter addressed directly to Attila the Hun.
It's incredible.
And enclosed with this letter is her personal solid gold signet ring. She explicitly begs Attila to intervene and rescue her from this forced betrothal. Now, reading these sources, I have a major question.
Okay, let's hear it.
Did an educated Roman princess actually want to marry the man responsible for the massacre at Nisus? Or was this a calculated political nuclear option, creating an international crisis just to force her brother to cancel the wedding?
It's a great question. The overwhelming consensus among modern historians is that she was seeking political leverage, not an actual Hunnic marriage ceremony.
That makes sense.
She was reaching out to the one entity on Earth her brother truly feared, hoping the mere threat of Attila's involvement would fracture Valentinian's control. She was playing a highly dangerous game of chicken with the fate of the entire empire.
But this is where Attila proves he's infinitely more sophisticated than a mere warlord. He looks at this smuggled signet ring, and he doesn't just see a desperate plea from a captive princess, he sees a legally binding contract.
Exactly. Attila's response is a masterclass in exploiting Roman law against the Romans. He formally receives the embassy, he accepts the ring, and he declares to the known world that he interprets this gesture as a legitimate, legally binding proposal of marriage.
Unbelievable.
He officially claims Justa Grata Honoria as his betrothed bride.
But he doesn't just want a wife, he's running an extortion racket. Because if she is a royal bride, she is legally entitled to a royal dowry.
And this is where it gets crazy.
He dispatches envoys to the imperial court at Ravenna with a breathtaking demand. He basically says, I have accepted your sister's proposal. As her rightful dowry, I demand the immediate cessation of half of the entire Western Roman Empire.
The audacity of that demand sent absolute shockwaves through the imperial court. Valentinian III was apoplectic with rage. He recognized instantly that his sister had handed Attila the perfect pretext for invasion. In his fury, he actually ordered Honoria to be executed for treason.
The execution was only halted because their mother, the formidable Empress Galla Placidia, physically intervened. She negotiated a stay of execution, though Honoria was immediately exiled and basically disappears from the historical records shortly after.
Meanwhile, Valentinian engages in a frantic diplomatic scramble. He sends letters to Attila's court, exhaustively detailing Roman family law.
Trying to lawyer his way out of it.
Exactly. He explains that the proposal was illegitimate, that women cannot inherit the empire under Roman legal tradition, and that Honoria possessed zero legal authority to offer state territory as a dowry.
But Attila is playing chess while Valentinian is reading a rulebook. Attila sends an envoy back with a message just dripping with geopolitical sarcasm. He declares that Honoria is entirely innocent, that her proposal is legally sound, and that he will be marching his armies westward to personally claim the property that is rightfully his.
Because Attila did not care about the nuances of Roman inheritance law. He had maximized the extortion potential of the Eastern Empire. They were tapped out. He needed to pivot his massive coalition westward to secure new plunder, and Honoria had handed him a flawless casus belli, a legally justifiable cause for war.
So the extortion racket mobilizes. In the spring of 451 AB, Attila gathers his vassals. The logistical scale of this mobilization is staggering. We are looking at a coalition comprising native Huns, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, Syrians, Harals, Thuringians, Alans, and Burgundians. They march west, bridge the Rhine River, and smash into the Roman province of Gaul, which constitutes modern-day France.
And the invasion strategy was characterized by speed and absolute devastation. They moved through Belgica, systematically reducing major economic centers. On April 7th, 451, they captured and sacked the city of Metz.
Just brutal.
They moved down the river valleys, pillaging Strasbourg, Worms, Mainz, and Trier. The religious texts from the period of the hagiographies of the local saints are saturated with the trauma of this invasion. They recount horrifying scenes of bishops being slaughtered over their altars, alongside stories of divine intervention.
Right, like Saint Genevieve supposedly saving Paris, or Bishop Lupus protecting Troyes through desperate negotiations. Attila is driving deep into the heart of the Western Empire. But the Romans deploy the one man capable of matching Attila's strategic intellect. The Magister Militum, the supreme military commander of the West, Flavius Aetius.
Aetius is arguably the most critical figure in this narrative, aside from Attila himself. He wasn't just a Roman aristocrat reading tactical manuals. As a youth, Aetius had spent years living as a political hostage among the Huns.
Hostage exchanges were standard diplomatic practice back then, right? To ensure peace treaties were honored.
Precisely. But Aetius used that time brilliantly. He learned their language. He embedded himself in their culture. And most importantly, he intensely studied the logistics and mechanics of Hunnic cavalry warfare.
So he knows how they fight.
He intimately understood how Attila's mind worked, and he recognized that the decaying Roman infantry could not defeat a united Hunnic coalition in open combat.
So Aetius executes a diplomatic miracle that defies all political logic of the era. He rides into southern Gaul, into the territory of the Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths, ruled by King Theodoric I, were technically settled on Roman land, but they harbored deep, deep hostility toward the imperial government.
They hated the Romans.
But Aetius sits down with Theodoric and delivers a blunt geopolitical reality. He essentially says, we despise each other, but Attila is burning his way south. If he destroys my legions, your kingdom is next. We have to form a coalition.
And Aetius manages to synthesize the impossible. He unites the Roman legions with their bitter rivals, the Visigoths. He brings in the Franks, the Celts, the Armoricans, and various unaligned Germanic tribes, forging a massive, unprecedented defensive alliance.
The two juggernauts finally collide at the siege of Aurelianum, which is modern-day Orleans. Attila has surrounded the city. The historian Jordanes claims that Attila targeted Aurelianum because he had a secret pact with Sangiban, the king of the Alans, who were stationed inside the city, expecting Sangiban to betray the Romans and throw open the gates.
Though we must approach that specific claim with historical skepticism.
Why is that?
Well, the Alans were generally the most reliable heavy cavalry in the Roman defensive network. Accusing them of treachery was a common trope among Gothic historians trying to elevate their own people's heroism. Regardless of internal espionage, the defenders of Aurelianum locked the gates and held the line.
They endured days of torrential rain and relentless Hunnic assaults. Just as Attila prepared to launch the final decisive breach of the walls on June 14th, his scouts reported a massive dust cloud on the horizon. Aetius and Theodoric's combined relief army had arrived.
This forces Attila into an immediate, critical strategic pivot.
Wait, if Attila has the most feared army on the continent, why doesn't he just turn around and fight Aetius right there under the walls of the city?
Because of the physics of his military machine. The Hunnic tactical advantage relies entirely on the mobility of their mounted archers and the shocking impact of their heavy cavalry.
Right, they need to move.
Exactly. If he fights while pinned against the heavily fortified walls of Aurelianum, with a hostile garrison at his back and a massive relief army hitting his front, he loses his mobility. He gets crushed in a choke point.
So he needs open ground. Attila breaks the siege and initiates a highly disciplined tactical retreat eastward, scanning the landscape for a battlefield that favors cavalry maneuvers. And Aetius is right on his heels, pushing his coalition forward to force an engagement before Attila can escape back across the Rhine. This high-stakes pursuit leads both massive, multi-ethnic armies to a sprawling, undulating landscape in northeastern France known as the Catalonian Plains,
which sets the stage for one of the most violent, consequential, and heavily debated battles of late antiquity.
The date is roughly June 20, 451 AD. The sheer scale of the forces assembling on this plain is staggering. Both commanders spend the entire morning carefully deploying their coalitions.
This raises an important question regarding ancient military doctrine. How exactly do you structure a battle line to absorb the impact of a Hunnic coalition? The geography dictates the strategy here. Jordanes describes the battlefield as a vast plain that rises sharply on one side to a prominent ridge. That ridge immediately became the tactical center of gravity. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled the momentum of the battle.
Aetius knows Attila's psychological tendencies, and he anticipates the Hunnic deployment perfectly. Attila places himself and his elite, personal Hunnic cavalry dead center in his battle line, intending to punch straight through the enemy's heart. He places his Ostrogoth vassals, commanded by the Amali brothers, on his left flank. On his right flank, he positions the Gepids, led by their fierce King Ardaric.
And Aetius constructs his defense to counter this specific weak distribution. He places his most heavily armored, disciplined troops, the core Roman legions, under his direct command on the left flank, positioned to absorb the assault of the Gepids.
Okay.
He positions King Theodoric and the Visigothic heavy cavalry on the right flank, facing their strange cousins, the Ostrogoths. And in the vulnerable center, directly in the path of Attila and his elite Huns, Aetius places Sangiban and the Alans.
That deployment seems incredibly risky. Why put the Alans, the troops whose loyalty was previously questioned, in the very center where the impact will be the most devastating?
It was a brutal, pragmatic calculation. Aetius needed heavy cavalry in the center to absorb the terrifying shock of the initial Hunnic charge. By placing the Alans there, flanked on both sides by the Romans and Visigoths, he ensured they couldn't retreat without fighting through their own allies. They were locked in place to act as a shock absorber.
Man, that is cold. The battle commences late in the afternoon, around the 9th hour, or roughly 2:30 p.m. The conflict immediately explodes around that strategic ridge. The Hunnic forces surge forward to seize the slope, but Aetius, anticipating this, coordinates a rapid advance with Thorismund, the son of the Visigothic king Theodoric. The Romans and Visigoths outpace the Huns, violently securing the crest of the ridge.
By taking the high ground, Aetius forces the Huns to attack uphill. This severely degrades the kinetic impact of their cavalry charge and exposes them to plunging missile fire. What ensues is a grinding, chaotic, horrifying melee.
The combat on the right flank is particularly vicious. The Visigoths clash with the Ostrogoths in a massive, swirling cavalry battle. And in the absolute heart of this carnage, tragedy strikes the coalition. King Theodoric III of the Visigoths is killed.
And the historiography surrounding his death presents two distinct narratives. Jordanes suggest the elderly king was thrown from his horse in the chaos and tragically trampled to death by his own advancing heavy cavalry.
Oh,
Yeah. The alternate account, heavily favored by Ostrogothic oral traditions, claims he was deliberately targeted and speared by an Ostrogoth noble named Andag.
The battlefield is so massive and chaotic that the Visigoth warriors don't even realize their king has fallen for quite some time. But when word finally ripples through the ranks, the psychological effect is the exact opposite of what Attila intended. Instead of breaking their morale, the death of their king drives the Visigoths into an absolute frenzy of vengeance.
And totally backfired.
Thorismund, now the de facto king, channels that rage into a ferocious Romano-Gothic countercharge sweeping down the slope of the ridge.
The momentum of that charge is overwhelming. The Alans in the center have miraculously held their ground, bogging down the Hunnic advance, and now Thorismund's heavy cavalry crashes violently into the exposed flank of Attila's personal household unit.
And for the first time in his recorded history, the Scourge of God experiences sheer, unmitigated vulnerability. His lines shatter. The coalition troops are cutting through his elite guard. Attila is forced to sound the retreat, pulling his surviving forces back into the rudimentary safety of his fortified wagon camp as the sun begins to set.
It is a stunning psychological reversal. The invulnerable warlord who terrorized two empires is now physically trapped behind a ring of wooden carts, listening to the roar of a victorious coalition army massing outside.
And the sources provide this incredibly cinematic, visceral detail about Attila's mindset in that moment. He assesses the tactical reality. The Romans and Visigoths have him surrounded. He firmly believes that the camp will be breached at dawn and he faces total annihilation. So he orders his men to construct a massive pyre out of highly flammable wooden horse saddles right in the center of the camp.
The intent was unmistakable. He was preparing a ritual suicide. He would rather throw himself into the inferno and burn alive than grant Aetius the ultimate triumph of capturing him, chaining him, and parading him through the streets of Rome in a triumph.
That is just epic. As darkness fully blankets the Catalonian plains, the command structures on both sides completely break down. The confusion is absolute. Thorismund actually gets disoriented in the dark and accidentally rides his horse straight into the Hunnic camp, taking severe wounds before his retainers desperately drag him to safety.
Talk about a close call.
And Aetius himself gets separated from his Roman vanguard and is forced to spend the night sheltering behind the shields of his Visigothic allies.
When dawn finally breaks, the sun illuminates a landscape of incomprehensible slaughter. The coalition forces quickly recognize their strategic advantage. Attila is pinned down inside his wagon fort, his supply lines are severed, and Aetius' archers maintain a constant barrage, preventing the Huns from mounting a breakout. The allies prepare to lay siege to the camp and finish the Hunnic threat forever.
It looks like the definitive end. But then Aetius makes a command decision that historians and military strategists have debated for 15 centuries. He engages in a masterful, incredibly cold-blooded piece of geopolitical manipulation.
Right. Aetius pulls Thorismund aside for a private council. Thorismund is grieving, hot-blooded, and desperate to order the assault to avenge his father. But Aetius whispers poison into his ear.
What does he say?
He warns Thorismund that his father's throne in Toulouse is currently empty. He suggests that if Thorismund stays here to fight a desperate, cornered Attila, his ambitious brothers back home will seize the treasury and usurp the Visigothic crown.
Oh, wow.
He convinces the young warrior that securing his political power at home is infinitely more urgent than finishing off a beaten enemy.
And Aetius doesn't stop there. He supposedly runs the exact same psychological operation on his Frankish allies, convincing them they need to rush home to secure their own territorial interests. Now, looking at this objectively, why on earth would a Roman general deliberately dismantle his own victorious coalition and let the man who burned half of Gaul escape?
Because Aetius is playing three-dimensional geopolitical chess. He surveys the chessboard of post-war Gaul. If he allows the coalition to completely annihilate the Hunnic army, the Visigoths will suddenly find themselves without a rival. They will become the uncontested military superpower in the region, and Aetius knows with absolute certainty that they will immediately turn their weapons against a severely weakened Rome.
Aetius needed Attila alive. He needed a wounded, defanged Hunnic empire to survive just enough to act as a geopolitical counterweight, keeping the Germanic tribes terrified and distracted.
It was a brutal balancing act. By persuading the Visigoths and Franks to abandon the field, Aetius effectively lifted the siege. Attila, likely bewildered by his survival, was allowed to quietly slip out of the camp and begin the long, agonizing retreat back across the Rhine.
The Romans claimed a strategic victory. They halted the invasion. They saved Gaul. But the cost, the human toll extracted on those plains, is almost beyond modern comprehension.
The ancient chroniclers recorded death tolls that staggered the imagination of the classical world. Jordanes confidently asserts there were 165,000 dead left rotting on the field. The Spanish chronicler Hydatius pushes that claim to apocalyptic 300,000 casualties.
I mean, logically, we have to push back on those numbers, right? Are we reading historical fact or just ancient propaganda designed to mythologize the battle?
Well, modern demographic and military historians universally view those specific figures as massive exaggerations.
That makes sense.
An ancient agricultural economy simply could not sustain the logistics required to feed hundreds of thousands of men and horses in a concentrated area for an extended campaign. However, we cannot entirely dismiss the narrative weight of those numbers. They represent the profound generational psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors.
It may not have been 300,000, but to the people standing on that ridge, it felt like 300,000.
Precisely. To the contemporary writers trying to process the event, it was slaughter on a scale that defied human language. It felt like a localized apocalypse. Jordanes included a haunting anecdote about a small brook bisecting the battlefield that became so gorged with the blood of the slain that it transformed into a Russian crimson torrent. And wounded men, dying of thirst in the summer heat, were forced to drink from it.
That is just horrifying. It was from the ashes of these apocalyptic campaigns that Attila earned his infamous, enduring title, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. And it's the era that produced his most terrifying, legendary boast recorded in the historical tradition. Surveying the devastation of his campaigns, he purportedly declared, "There where I have passed, the grass will never grow again."
And Aetius's Machiavellian gamble to keep the scourge of God alive had immediate, catastrophic consequences for the Italian peninsula.
Right, because Attila's ego and his extortion economy could not sustain the humiliation of a retreat. The very next year, in 452 AD, he regroups his shattered forces. He declares that his claim on Honoria is still valid, and he still demands his dowry.
He just won't let it go.
But this time, he bypasses the heavily defended plains of Gaul. He drives his army straight through the Julian Alps and invades northern Italy. He is marching directly on the heart of the empire.
And his campaign in Italy is characterized by unbridled fury. He lays siege to the magnificent fortified city of Aquileia, situated at the head of the Adriatic Sea. When the city finally falls after a grueling, protracted siege, Attila unleashes a level of destruction that is unprecedented even for him.
Unprecedented how?
He orders the city razed so thoroughly, the infrastructure dismantled so completely, that Aquileia virtually vanishes from the physical map. The trauma of this specific event forced the surviving population to flee into the treacherous, muddy coastal lagoons for safety, a desperate migration that ultimately led to the founding of the city of Venice.
The terror spreads southward. He sacks Milan. He sacks Padua. Aetius, having exhausted his diplomatic capital in Gaul the previous year, possesses no standing army capable of stopping him in Italy. Attila marches to the banks of the Po River. The road to Rome is wide open. It looks like the Eternal City is finally going to be put to the torch. But then, in a desperate final maneuver, the emperor sends an embassy of 3 men to meet Attila at his camp, including the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I.
And the exact dialogue of that meeting is heavily obscured by centuries of church mythology, which later depicted miraculous visions of Saints Peter and Paul appearing in the sky, wielding flaming swords to terrify the barbarian king into submission.
I mean, I love a good flaming sword story, but given everything we've learned about Attila's highly pragmatic, calculating nature, the historical reality has to be deeply rooted in logistics, doesn't it?
It was entirely logistical. Italy had suffered a devastating famine in 451. When Attila's massive coalition arrived in 452, the countryside was already stripped bare. There was no grain to forage, his army was actively starving.
Oh, wow.
And waterborne diseases, likely severe dysentery or malaria, were sweeping violently through his encampments, decimating his ranks. Furthermore, strategic intelligence reached his camp that the new Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian had crossed the Danube and was actively raiding the unprotected Hunnic homelands.
So Attila is sitting in a swamp, his men are starving, they're dying of disease, his homeland is under attack, and the Pope rides into camp offering an astronomically massive bribe of gold to leave. Attila calculates the odds, accepts the payoff, and frames a desperate tactical retreat as an act of diplomatic mercy.
It's all about optics.
He turns the army around and marches back across the Alps to his wooden palace on the Hungarian plain. He survives the carnage of Gaul, he survives the disease of Italy, It seemed no army, no general, and no climate on Earth could truly put an end to Attila the Hun.
Which is precisely why his actual demise the following year remains one of the most jarring, anticlimactic events in ancient history.
It really is. If you wrote this into a script, a producer would reject it for being completely unbelievable. The year is 453 AD. Attila is back at his palace complex. He has just taken a new bride, adding to his harem. She is a beautiful, young, Germanic woman named Ildiko.
The sources indicate the wedding was marked by a massive, raucous celebration. The Hunnic aristocracy utilized banquets to display wealth and cement alliances, and Attila partook with extreme indulgence.
He spends the entire night consuming staggering quantities of alcohol. Finally, heavily intoxicated, he retires to his private bedchambers with Ildiko. The sun rises the next morning. Attila does not emerge. The morning stretches into the afternoon. His elite guards wait outside the doors, growing increasingly anxious. Finally, fearing treason, they shatter the wooden doors and breach the chamber.
The scene they encountered was utterly devoid of martial glory. They found the young bride, Ildiko, huddled in the corner under her veil, weeping hysterically. And Attila the Hun was lying dead on his back in the bed, saturated in his own blood, yet the guards could find no visible knife wound on his body.
So what does this all mean? Did this young Germanic princess, whose people had been brutally subjugated by the Huns, managed to secretly assassinate the scourge of God on their wedding night?
Conspiracy theories and rumors of assassination circulated almost immediately and persisted for centuries. About 80 years after the event, a Roman chronicler named Marcellinus comes officially recorded a rumor that Attila was pierced by the blade of his wife in the dark.
Which sounds very dramatic.
It does. Others whispered of untraceable poison slipped into his wine. However, the most credible official account, provided by the contemporary diplomat Priscus, points to a much more medically plausible, unglamorous reality.
Priscus records that Attila passed out face up in a profound drunken stupor and suffered a severe nasal hemorrhage. Because he was so heavily intoxicated, his gag reflex failed. He couldn't wake up to clear his airway, and he simply drowned, choking to death on his own blood.
Modern medical analysis, examining his documented history of extreme binge drinking and high-stress leadership, suggests a more systemic failure. He likely suffered from advanced liver cirrhosis. A common complication of this disease is the development of esophageal varices, severely dilated fragile veins in the lower esophagus.
Oh, I see.
The massive consumption of alcohol that night likely caused a spike in blood pressure, rupturing those varices. He literally hemorrhaged to death from the inside out.
The warlord who shattered the geopolitical foundation of Europe, who survived the bloodiest battle of the era, taken out by esophageal bleeding on his wedding night. But his generals and warriors, they ensured his final send-off permanently enshrined his terrifying mythology.
The funeral rites described in the texts are deeply morbid and profoundly fascinating. Jordanes records that when his elite guard confirmed his death, they did not shed tears. Instead, they sheared off their hair and took their cavalry swords to their own faces, slicing deep gashes into their cheeks. Their cultural belief dictated that the greatest of warlords should be mourned not with the lamentations of women, but with the blood of warriors.
They construct a silken tent in the middle of the vast Hungarian plain and lay his body in state. For days, his elite horsemen ride in continuous hypnotic circles around the tent, chanting ancient dirges that recount his conquests and the wealth he extracted from the earth. And then, under the cover of absolute darkness, they conduct the burial.
The interment mechanics were designed to symbolize his ultimate dominion. They placed his body inside 3 nested coffins. The innermost sarcophagus was forged of pure gold, the second of solid silver, and the outermost casing was made of iron.
What do they signify?
The iron represented his unyielding military subjugation of the nations, while the silver and gold were literal manifestations of the massive economic tribute he had extorted from the Roman empires.
And to guarantee that this staggering hoard of wealth and the body of the king himself would never be discovered, looted, or desecrated by his enemies, they buried him in a remote, undisclosed location. To maintain absolute secrecy, the guards immediately executed every single laborer and gravedigger involved in the burial. To this very day, despite centuries of searching, the tomb of Attila the Hun remains undiscovered.
And with his body in the ground, the fatal flaw of his extortion empire was immediately exposed. Attila had ruled exclusively through the sheer gravity of personal terror and charisma. He built a massive coalition, but he never constructed enduring bureaucratic institutions or codified laws to sustain it after his death.
His sons Alak, Dengizich, and Ernak didn't view the empire as a sacred state. They viewed it as a family estate to be liquidated. They immediately began squabbling, attempting to carve up the vassal tribes and divide the territory among themselves.
Which the vassal kings, many of whom commanded massive seasoned armies of their own, absolutely refused to tolerate. Ardaric, the fiercely loyal king of the Gepids who had anchored Attila's right flank at the Catalonian plains, saw the weakness of the Huns and immediately incited a massive rebellion. In 454 AD, a mere 12 months after Attila choked on his own blood, the Germanic vassals engaged the Hunnic loyalists at the Battle of Nedau. They shattered the Hunnic forces, killed Attila's eldest son Elac, and permanently broke the back of the Hunnic Empire.
So bringing this vast, violent narrative back to you, the listener, and your curation project for young Shengli and Ra's Hall of Ruthless Rulers, Attila undeniably earns his place in that hall. But we must discard the myth of the mindless barbarians swinging a club.
He belongs in that hall because he was a brilliant, highly educated extortionist. He was a pioneer of geopolitical psychological warfare. He intuitively understood how to weaponize his enemies' internal political fractures, as he did so masterfully with the Honoria affair, and how to bind a fragile, multi-ethnic coalition together purely through the application of unrelenting, terrifying willpower.
He didn't seek to govern the Roman Empire. He sought to establish a captive market, a continental subscription model where Rome paid a premium in gold simply for the privilege of not burning to the ground.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as you finalize your candidate. Attila's empire vanished almost instantaneously. He left behind no grand Roman architecture, no codified legal systems, no enduring dynasty. It is incredibly easy to dismiss him as merely a destructive, transient force of nature.
But look at the permanent geopolitical architecture his destruction ultimately achieved.
Exactly. By forcing the agrarian Germanic tribes across the rivers and violently embedding them within Roman territory, and by pushing the Western Roman Empire's military and economic infrastructure to its absolute breaking point, Attila did more to redraw the borders, shift the demographics, and dictate the future of modern Europe than almost any Roman emperor who came before him. We rightly remember him as the man who shattered the ancient world, but we must ask, by clearing the board so violently, was he actually the unintentional, ruthless architect of the medieval world that followed?
It's a chilling thought. It turns out you don't always need to draft the blueprints for a new world. Sometimes you just have to be the bowling ball heavy enough to shatter the old one beyond repair. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this comprehensive analysis provides young Xingli and Ra with exactly the nuanced perspective they need for their haul. Keep exploring the mechanics of history, keep questioning the myths, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.